And that story, like, I didn't tell that story till probably 2.5 years ago. Like,
Wow.
nobody in my life had ever heard that story. And I told it on stage because all of my speaker friends were like, you got to tell that. And every event I've done since then that I've told that story, somebody's come up and been like, I fought that for 30 years. I had the same thing.
When you're driven, the need to accomplish a goal is relentless. Hard work and ambition compel you to do whatever's necessary. In my work as a personal injury trial lawyer for 18 years, it's common to meet driven people. Those with drive can have different personalities, careers, or backgrounds, but they possess one common factor. Despite their passions, driven people want to surround and motivate themselves with other driven people. If you want to learn how to overcome obstacles by learning from others, then tune in here. This is the Driven Crowd Podcast.
Thank you for tuning into episode 47 of the Driven Crowd Podcast, fueled by Snellings Law. I'm your host, Scott Snellings. Today, I'm joined by Jake Thompson, a leadership performance coach and the Chief Encouragement Officer at Compete Every Day. Jake started Compete Every Day in 2011 by selling t-shirts out of the trunk of his car. Jake has spent more than a decade working with leaders and organizations all over the world on how they can get better results for themselves and for their teams. He's been featured in Forbes, hosts a podcast in the top 1% globally, and has directly impacted over 80,000 ambitious leaders. Jake, welcome to the Driven Crowd Podcast, my friend.
Thanks for having me. It's funny, as we were sitting here, I can literally see right across 635 where I was selling those t-shirts, that old CrossFit gym that used to be there.
And so how did you get into the selling t-shirts thing? How did you end up there selling t-shirts in the back of your car instead of, a promising, a nice job?
That's what a lot of friends ask that same question. So I went to TCU over in Fort Worth, grew up thinking I was going to be Jerry Maguire. Marcus and I, our mutual friend, probably even had early conversations as he was kind of going through school. I really wanted to get into sports agency. And so I started interviewing with agencies, interned with a group based here at the time. And what happened was, as soon as I graduated TCU, the NFL changed the rule that you had to have a master's or a law degree. And I was like, crap. So I went to the University of Dallas in Irving because at the time they were the only DFW school that offered a sports business MBA. And because of my GPA, I didn't have to take the GMAT. So I was like, I'm in. Like, that's the easiest route.
There you go.
Moved over, went through that program, finished in December of 2008. But about 3 weeks before graduation, I decided that's not what I want to do with the rest of my life. I didn't like seeing how the hot dog was made. I was falling out of love with football, which was like my love growing up here in Texas. And a lot of it had to do with the guy I worked for. Not the most ethical character, I'll say. And so there was a lot of sour taste in my mouth. And so I got out. It was 2008. I can't get a job. I have experience at an agency. I did promotions for the Dallas Cowboys and their radio shows. I did substitute teaching in Coppell. I did all of these assorted things while getting my MBA to pay bills, because the agency life was like, eat what you kill. And until you're bringing guys in, like, you're not making anything. And I can't get a job. And I laughed that Best Buy won't even hire me for holiday hours. And so I reached out to
It's that TCU degree, man. That's what was holding you back.
I'm telling you.
TCU.
I reach out to my network and say, hey, listen, I've got an MBA. I have this experience. I think I'm pretty good at marketing. Where can I help your business? Like, what are your needs right now? If I can't help it, let me see if I can find somebody. And so I just focused on building a network and adding value. And I would get a small project of, hey, I need a small business website. So I'd make a little website. They would refer me to someone else. And then I started building a client base and got to where I was working with a real estate development, a very large telecom tech company, and a few other groups on either basic social media, getting their platform up, blogging, or building little small business websites. I was making great money. I was living in Addison. I laughed. My roommate and our apartment was maybe $800. And so $400 a guy. I have a new car. We're going out every weekend. And I was miserable. I was probably 50 pounds heavier than I am now, gotten out of shape, drinking all the time. And I was like, man, this sucks. Like,
yeah.
I read, if you've ever read the book by Donald Miller, A Million Miles in 1,000 Years. And
I have not, no.
So Miller wrote a book years ago called Blue Like Jazz, and it was on his faith journey, and he talked about the relational aspect. And I remember reading it, and it really kind of shaking me in a few areas of how I'd grown up in super conservative Southern Baptist East Texas, and reevaluating kind of my journey. And then this new book comes out, And it's about his journey to make that first book into a movie. And how he just wants to throw the book out there, and the directors are like, no, we have to have tension. We have to have conflict. You have to have all these things. And what Miller comes to find out is that great stories mirror great lives. And to have a great life and a great story, you have to have conflict. You have to have a mission that's bigger than just you. And you got to do something that brings others alongside. And I remember reading that and thinking, my story sucks. And I'm building this wonderful sandcastle. And as soon as the tide comes in and my time goes out, like that's it. I've done nothing that lasts. And so I started exploring this idea of what would it look like to be intentional with how you show up in life. And so for me, it started in the gym. 24-hour in Addison. I would just go into the 24-hour fitness every day, start lifting again, trying to be that old athlete, to play basketball, do everything. And every day it was like, can I do a little bit more weight? Can I go a little bit harder? Can I do a little bit better playing ball? And over time, I started applying that confidence to my work of, can I deliver a better project even though they paid me the same thing? Can I do a better job on my sales pitch than I did last time? Can I add another client? Where can I get aggressive, being intentional instead of going through the motions? And that really kicked into high gear probably in the summer of 2010 when I joined that CrossFit gym over there. It used to be CrossFit Strong. And the idea of every day pushing yourself against the clock was something I hadn't done before, because I'd always grown up in team sports and it was me and the guy on the depth chart. Like, I just got to be better than you to play. And this was forcing me in that me versus me mentality, because there were other people there, but it was really like, can I do better than my last time?
Yeah.
And so as I chewed on that, I came up with different ideas and eventually settled into this compete every day. And as I talked to friends, they were like, man, that resonates. What are you going to do with it? I don't know. I don't have a clue. Like, I'm marketing. And so I was like, well, maybe I'll build it and make it my marketing agency. And I'll just do this agency around this idea of helping people be better. And that didn't work. And I looked at a few other things. And after like 8 months of just spinning my wheels, my best friend goes, hey, there's a t-shirt company out of Boston called Life is Good. And he said, it's two guys. They started selling out of a van. Funny enough, their stick figure logo is a guy named Jake. Like, what if you sold shirts? So at the time, he and I had saved up money to go to New Zealand. My biggest consulting client went under as a startup. The next day, he got laid off from his job doing teacher certification. And so we're like, do you want to take the trip? And he's like, well, I just bought an engagement ring for Kristen, now his wife. And I was like, all right, well, I'm not going to do the trip alone. And so I put it into a couple of boxes of shirts and tanks and had printed this CED compete every day and thought, you know, people who work out, who are active, wear shirts. Let's see. And I didn't think anything other than, hey, this is a cool way to encourage people. And it started to resonate. And initially it was just friends, I think, who felt sorry for me, who were like, yeah, we'll buy a shirt. But then it started to take off. And it was the Dallas Rock and Roll Marathon in March of 12 where I really thought I had something, because over the span of about 15 minutes, 3 to 4 people came in, looked at the exact same shirt, asked a different question about it, and said, that resonates with me. And I was like, oh, so it's hitting people in different spots. Maybe there's something here. And so then I was like, all right, giddy up, let's go.
Dang. All right. So let's drop back a little bit. So you graduate from University of Dallas with your master's.
Yep.
And how did you end up like designing websites and doing social media? Did you know anything about that?
So it was really funny. So my undergrad, because growing up, I was a teacher's kid. Mom was a teacher, grandmother's a teacher. High school was super easy for me. I finished, I think, 3rd in our high school class, and I didn't really study. College, I didn't know how to study. And so the first semester wrecked me. I remember pulling all-nighters for an accounting class, a world religion class, something else. And I swear to this day, my world religion teacher, I failed the class, but he passed me and gave me a B because I would be the only person in class who would ask questions and debate. I would just talk. And to this day, I swear he passed me and shouldn't have.
You made class interesting for him. I made
class interesting. And he just knew, like, I didn't know I'd ask questions. And so when I finished the first semester, I was like, I can't get into the business school. So I switched to journalism, which was advertising and PR, because I thought, okay, well, if I'm doing agent work, PR is the next best thing other than business. So in that, you learn very basic Photoshop and graphic design. Well, when I started interning for the agency, it was a smaller agency. And I thought, well, how do you stand out when you're going against the creative artists, the big names? You have really good collateral that catches attention. And so I would stay up late. I bought all of these how-to books and just taught myself Adobe Illustrator and Photoshop, and could I make a PDF document that sold the agency and what we did and at least got us in the door versus somebody who's like, here's a Word doc. And that's really where I started to learn it. And then the website stuff was tinkering with it, trying to figure it out, because I was trying to make our website and then I was making my own consulting website and thought, well, I can make these very basic ones pretty easy. And so it was really just that of nothing else is working, let's figure it out.
Which I love that mentality, right? Because you laugh that you couldn't get a Best Buy job. You could have found a job somewhere doing something.
I sent out so many applications and couldn't get anything because what I kept running into
was overqualified.
Overqualified or underqualified, right? I was overqualified for entry level because I had MBA. And so they were like, well, you have an MBA and you have work experience. So you probably want too much. And I'm like, I want anything now. But they're like, you probably want too much. Or you're underqualified because your work experience isn't real corporate work. So, and we don't have entry level. So I kept hitting roadblocks on both of those, which looking back was the best thing in the world because it kind of put me on this path of like, you got to figure this out. But at the same time, it was the most frustrating because I was like, I have a good degree. I have an MBA. I can't get a job.
But you didn't just sit there and feel sorry for yourself either. You said, okay, you know what? If these people aren't going to hire me, if I can't get a job doing this, then I'm going to figure something out. And then you actually put the effort in to do it. And so that sounds like kind of the beginning of Compete Every Day right there.
Yeah, I mean, it was. So I grew up Jacksonville, Texas, 2 hours east of us, town of 13,000. My dad owned a small gas station. So when my grandfather on my mom's side was a cotton farmer, had a small cotton farm in West Texas. My grandfather on my dad's side was a contractor, had an own contracting business. My dad opened his little gas station. Like that was my first job at 7. And so I saw firsthand the importance of building and taking initiative on that stuff. And so I kind of knew like, at the very least, maybe I'll go back and work in the gas station. But I was like, I don't want to go back to East Texas. Like I wanted to stay here in the Metroplex. And so I was like, I just have to figure something out to pay the bills. And so it's kind of that played back later in life, later in my career, when your back's against the wall, like you either cower or rise to the challenge. And so that was a really good training ground for me to say, regardless of what's going on in the market, I was ignorant enough to know there was a recession, but really not understand it because I wasn't around real estate and some of the really impacted industries to just say like, there's got to be an opportunity. I just haven't banged on enough doors.
Yeah. I'm very familiar with that economy. I quit a good paying job in 2008 to go start a law firm with another guy. And naivety can be really good for you at times, right? Because it allows you to take risks that you otherwise would never take in a million years if you actually knew what was beyond the decision. All right, so you think you have something here with a Compete Everyday t-shirt at the Rock and Roll Marathon. What's the next step?
The next step was just doing more of that. Honestly, I started traveling the country. First it was my F-150 and then I eventually got a Sprinter van, but I would travel everywhere doing CrossFit competitions, doing big regional events, doing rock and roll marathons. I'd pay for a booth, set up and sell. And so 2012, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, we were heavy events. And what's really interesting is we grew pretty quick. Like first year I laughed like $7,000 in sales. I don't know what I'm doing. 2012, we just missed $100,000. 2013, over 200K in sales. But my problem was I picked up a ton of expenses because what happened as I was building, I started looking at everyone else. I got out of the me versus me and said, well, that group does this when you do that. That group looks really big. We should do that. And my ego started to come into play because I didn't want to be the owner of a company working in the booth. I didn't want to be the guy selling t-shirts to the trunk of the car. I wanted to look legit. And so I massively racked up debt. And the problem in a product-based business, when you have debt, it's really hard to dig out because every time you go sell $20,000 worth of gear, you turn around and buy $15,000 more because you always have to have something to sell. And so the business kept growing, but the debt was kind of hovering and growing there with us. And so in 2015, 16, we're having our best sales years ever. I've got a team. We're doing events all over the US, but I'm still like, man, I feel like I'm just in this uphill battle against debt. Like, what are we doing here? And so it was during that time I'd met my wife. We'd gotten married in late 2015, and I was leaving town Thursday or Friday, and I was gone until Sunday or Monday. She works in title, so she's off on Friday, Saturday, Sunday. And I was like, this is not going to work long term. Like,
Yeah.
I've got to be
We don't
home
get
when
to see
she's
each
home.
other.
I know.
Yeah.
And so I was like, what was the core? The whole core of why I started the company was, how do we help people be more intentional to, more than anything, battle against their default? The default to be complacent, to do what's comfortable, to play it safe. How do we help people compete? And when I explored that, I said, there's got to be another way to do that. And so my team at the time, some great guys here locally, were just like, you should write a book, or you need to do speaking more. And I'd done a random speaking event here or there. A company, Texas Children's Hospital, brought me in, and the VP pulls me aside and says, go do more of that. I was like, I'm building a t-shirt company. But at this point,
I make t-shirts, man.
I'm like, this is why I do t-shirts. And Linda Aldred, to this day, I owe her. She was like, you need to do this. And so 2016, I started exploring, like, what would it look like if I just focused on the mission and versus the channel, how we're doing it. At the time, happened to come across a guy that taught speakers the business. And I watched him coach people and thought, there's so much I have no idea about this world. And in my head, it was like, you got to be a Tony Robbins or Zig Ziglar. You got to be John Maxwell to do this.
Right.
And Michael showed, like, no, you don't. And so 2016 and 17, I make a massive investment to learn the business side of speaking and coaching. I've always been a junkie in leadership development, professional development. Since that day, I was like, I got to change my story. I tried to read everything for the longest, thinking there's a tipping point. I just have to figure out what it is, without realizing it's all the little things stacked over time.
Right.
And so I became obsessed with all this, went through this program to learn speaking and coaching, got out in 2017, got a couple of keynotes from customers having events, and didn't have a business. I couldn't get more gigs. And I think, what did I do here? Because I took all of my attention, and I told our team, I said, 2017, we're all in on events. I'm going to learn the speaking thing. 2018, we're going off to speaking and focus. We're not doing events because the cost, really 16 to 18, the amount of competitors who came into the fitness space quadrupled. The competition went up, as well as all the events said, well, you guys are making a lot of money at these events. We want more of it. So the booth fees went up. So we saw a swing to where you're netting $100,000 a year net from events to you're losing $5,000.
Oh, wow.
Like, it was a massive. And so that equates to inventory and everything. So heading into 2018, I've invested all of this money into learning the speaking. I've shifted our business, and we are just drowning. The sales are going down dramatically because our customers were just used to seeing us offline. I'm questioning everything. And I get to about May of that year, and it was, or April, I'll say, because April, I reached out to a friend who coached speakers as well, and he focused on the business. I said, Grant, I've known you for a decade. Tell me what you're teaching now. I'm at the end of my rope. Like, I need to learn this. And so he's like, go through our program. So I started going through the program, and I'll remember this day till the day I die. It was May of 2018. And this is the second month in a row I've skipped paycheck to make sure our team gets paid because we don't have enough funds. I have an Amex bill of about 25 to 30K that I can't pay, and they're calling. And my wife comes home from work one day, and I hadn't told her any of this. And she comes home from work, and I'm having a breakdown in the kitchen. And her first thought is, oh my God, do you have cancer? Do you have testicular cancer? And
that specific
and
one.
I had like tears running down. I'm like, what? And she's like, do you have cancer? And I was like, no. She's like, I've only ever seen you cry once, and it was when one of our dogs died. And I was like, no, like, I have this bill I can't pay. And she was like, my past life, like, we had that. Like, we'll deal with this. And I was like, I think this is I know I made the right decision. I just don't know how long it's going to take. And she was like, just show up. And so that day forward, I wrote this long letter to myself. I still have in my phone of going back to the story of Joseph. And Donald Miller had actually said this at an event, and it always stuck with me, about the story of Joseph. Thought he was going to rule his brothers. His brothers throw him into a well, sell him to slavery. He rises up in the Egyptian household, and he's accused of rape. He's thrown into prison. He rises back up again. And so, like, every point where he thinks it's over, there's a turning point. And the story only gets good if you don't give up in the pit. And I told myself that every day of, like, don't give up. And the day I had to let my team go, all except one person, one of the guys who, God bless him, still a dear friend, said, this is going to be an incredible part of your story one day if you don't give up. And I was like, okay. And so in 2018, I just went all in on learning sales and business development. and said, this is the move. And in 2019, the harvest starts to develop little by little. And then in 2020, everything took off. Even when COVID hit, the business doubled and grew. And that's all I do now. And so it's literally been the resilience in 2018 was the result of the 2010 and 2008 stuff. But I never thought this would be the road I was on.
And so when you say you went all in on the marketing and the business development, what does that mean?
Yeah. So essentially at the time, our apparel business, we were solely focused on doing events every weekend. We were trying to sell to wholesale accounts and doing some online advertising. When we shifted, we cut all of the events out. Mm-hmm. We focused solely on Facebook ads, Instagram ads. We cut a lot of our wholesale accounts because they really weren't profitable. They were too small. Our main account was Rogue Fitness. Still to this day, we've worked with them for a decade. They're our main wholesale account that we keep. And then I just started prospecting and building. Like I had to learn old school prospecting again of how do I solve a problem? What's the problem I solve as a speaker? And reaching out to those industries. And so it was everyday working emails and follow-ups and phone calls and going to events and talking to people and leveraging referrals. And so it was just the straight up grind. And at the same time, it was trying to figure out, we have this whole apparel business over here. How do we stabilize it while this is going? And what's so wild is there were 4 different points where I was like, we just got to get rid of this. It's weighing me down to focus here. And what happened is when COVID hits, January of 2020, I've doubled my speaking business. We have over 6 figures in revenue contracted coming in. I get off a plane March 13th from an Omaha insurance conference and it disappears. I remember sitting at the bar after a talk watching the NBA cancel. And I'm like, well, that's not good. It's just 2 weeks. It's just 2 weeks. We'll be fine. And then all of a sudden the events start canceling. We're cutting checks back. And so I'm cutting $10,000, $20,000 back to clients. And I'm just like, what in the world's going to happen? Well, what happens? Everybody gets stimulus checks. Everybody starts shopping online. So the apparel that we were getting ready to phase out explodes because everybody's forced to shop online and we have all this inventory. So we are literally from February, March, really through July, fulfilling out of my garage. My garage was floor to ceiling inventory. We'd moved it out of a warehouse group that we'd had some issues with. I was trying to find office space, the one we're eventually in now. And so it's me and my wife and one of my team members would come over and we'd ship out of the garage. And then as we got an office space in July and companies start reaching out in Texas and Florida saying, hey, we're having events virtually or in person. And so we just started rebuilding that direction.
Man, so that aspect of the business that you were ready to let go of a couple of different times is the one that saved you.
It is. It really is, because it bought us the time between when the speaking really started back. What's crazy to me is 2 years ago, we had a conversation, even a year and a half ago, because my speaking and coaching has really exploded. We had a conversation a couple of years ago about selling or licensing the apparel side. And I even went into conversations with 2 different groups and couldn't quite bring myself to it because I thought, if I sell this or even if I license it and you do anything that damages the brand, it hurts my speaking,
right.
It hurts my ability to impact. And so I stopped. Well, then this year, not even 2 months ago, and it was funny, I couldn't even get through the podcast without having a breakdown. There was a guy in August, Mike Bednards out of New York. He runs a roofing company with his brother. Falls off a roof. The ladder slips, falls off a roof. Should have been dead. Put in the hospital, fractures all up and down his neck, loses sight in one of his eyes, brain injuries, and he starts going through the rehabilitation process. And his brother bought him a couple of our shirts and a flag, and he hung the flag in the hospital room and said, just beat yesterday. That was it. Just beat yesterday. Get a little bit better today. And so about 2-3 months ago, we get an Instagram message, and it's all these pictures of Mike's rehab, and it's the flag, and it's how that impacted him. And I'm at the airport reading this. My team sent it to me after an event, and I'm crying in the airport. And I call Mike up, and we had Mike on the podcast, and my wife was like, you can't get rid of the apparel. I don't care if you lose money, you can't get rid of this now. And that was really the awakening for me of even if it stays as a break even for us in the overall business scheme, it can never go away for that reason, because even if it's one person a year, it helps them dig out of a hole. Like, that's one person impacted, and it's worth it.
Man, that is so cool. I can only imagine seeing how your company has changed someone's life. You know, we doing personal injury, we get to help people, and it's awesome to, at the end of a case, see them have gone from this terrible, terrible point in their lives all the way through the healing process, all the way through the legal process, and to finally be able to shed that stress, shed all of those things from their lives, and celebrate with them. You know, because they've been through something absolutely awful, and to be able to walk them through that process is, man, so gratifying. It just fills my cup.
I was going to say, and what's even probably cooler that you don't get to see is, where does their trajectory go from there because of what you did? Like that, that's the one thing people ask me about as a speaker. Like, do you get to see the outcome? Occasionally you hear from a manager of like, hey, it's 6 months later, we're doing this, here's what happened. But most often you don't. You plant the seeds and you allow God to handle the harvest. And so for y'all, you get to celebrate. But man, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, how does that life look different because of what y'all did in that moment of storm for them that never would have come to fruition?
Yeah. Occasionally we do get to hear back. You know, we try to keep in touch with our clients, and I'll never forget, you know, the settlement at the end of the day. They'd been through a terrible crash, and they were able to buy a home for their family, and they had, you know, never had a home before, and it was absolutely amazing. And that's something that I still just cherish to this day. Yeah, was that result. That's awesome. And how that affected their life. You had mentioned earlier kind of going from that team mindset to the you versus you. That is an incredibly difficult transition, because when you're in a team, it's more like, hey, I got to hold up my end of the bargain, right? I'm not necessarily fully responsible for the result. I just got to do my part and trust everybody else. But when it's that individual competition, it's on you, man.
It's always on you.
It's always on you. And if you're not pushing, then it's just not going to happen. And so how did you make that mental transition? I mean, obviously you kind of had to a little bit. You were forced into it. But mentally, what did that look like for you? How did you get from, all right, I just got to beat the guy on the depth chart, to, I mean, this is all me. Yeah. I'm responsible for putting food on the table, gas in the car, all other things. Yeah.
So it's interesting. So there's two parts to that, right? So the team mentality, overall, the team mentality I still have from a standpoint of, I think, and you have as well, from a leadership standpoint, I've got to own my role, do it to the best of my ability, but the outcome is also determined by others. I think that's where most people struggle stepping into a leadership role, is they go from an individual, like it's all on me, to, oh no, it's on we now. And how do I get the we there? Where I struggled was in the comparison game within that context of, I only have to be better than the guys on my depth chart versus I have to be the best me. And where that ran me into trouble is I had an opportunity to go to TCU. Just Marcus is our shining example of our stud athlete, right? But I had committed to SMU my senior year. I was going to go play football there with two other guys I went to high school with. And May of my senior year, something in my gut just didn't sit right. It was interactions with the coaches, something I just said, I don't think this is the place. One of my receivers went to TCU, talked to their coaches, said, hey, I've got my old quarterback, wants to come play. And so they gave me academic athletic scholarship to come be a preferred walk-on. And so the summer before my freshman year, tear my shoulder up in an all-star game, go through the whole rehab process throughout the fall. So I'm just a student in the fall. I'm working out, rehabbing, going to class. Spring, I'm supposed to come out for football. Well, I'm kind of like, I'm supposed to hear from guys. I don't hear from anybody. So I go out like 2 weeks after semester started, and they're like, hey, we're wondering when you were going to be here. You know, we knew you were rehabbing. So I had my own schedule by myself. So I am working out by myself, going to class by myself. I'm living in the football dorms, but I'm doing my own thing. And it was the first time in my life I didn't have anybody to compare myself with. Like, I knew there were other guys on the team, but I wasn't seeing them. I wasn't training with them. I didn't know what my target was. And I became incredibly insecure and depressed. And for me, because it was the first time in my life not having that person to compare myself with that I had to be better than. And the problem I realized later is that all of my worth and happiness was just improving. I was better than them. Then am I doing my best? And it literally came to a head in the spring. I finished a Friday workout probably before spring break, well before spring football. And I had been like asking, hey, can I start studying playbooks? Can I train with guys? And I wasn't getting anywhere because you're a walk-on. That's what happens, right? And I was just like, if I don't learn it, I'm never going to beat them if I don't see who I'm against. And so one Friday afternoon, I finished a workout and left, walked into the locker room, caught my reflection in the mirror. I'll remember to the day I die. And I hated the person looking at me. I was terrified that coaches were going to come in, Mike Singfield or Gary Patterson were going to come in and say, you're not supposed to be here. We made a mistake. You need to go back to being a student. You need to go to another school. I was really overwhelmed with the fear of, if I'm not good enough, if I fail, if I don't make the roster, if I don't start, what kind of loser am I? Because up until that point, my entire life and identity had been built on being a quarterback. And I had this just pit in my stomach fear of, what will other people think of me, and how much of a loser and lack of worth will I have if I can't do the thing I came here to do? And the problem with that was I was comparing myself to, I didn't have anybody to compare myself with, right? I had a whole loss of identity, and I failed to understand that the next level of growth required a next level of me. And that was going to be very uncomfortable to get through. But if I wanted it, I have to get it. And in that moment, I walked away. I was too afraid of failing. And so I went back. I said, my shoulder's still not right. Went back to being a student, and it ate me. Like, I would play intramural football. We had one of the best teams on campus. Quintilly, my old receiver, Quinley, Corey Raj, all the guys that played, some guys that went to the NFL would come out and watch intramurals and be like, you need to be out there with us. Like, you can play. I was like, I don't think I'm right. Like, just terrified. And it ate at me forever because I was too afraid to fail at the one thing I wanted, because of, one, where my identity was. Two, I didn't understand that discomfort was part of growth. And that story, like, I didn't tell that story till probably 2.5 years ago. Like,
wow.
Nobody in my life had ever heard that story. And I told it on stage because all of my speaker friends were like, you got to tell that. And every event I've done since then that I've told that story, somebody's come up and been like, I fought that for 30 years. I had the same thing. And so for me, going through that, it was in that 20s when I was trying to change my life and I start competing with myself, that I really start to find the fulfillment of the growth and the joy in growing and getting better, and start to realize like where I got off. And I would become more aware when I'd catch myself comparing myself to others. And then you start to realize, oh, I'm comparing myself to that person, but I mean, they're not even as good as me at that. So why am I taking pride in beating them in what I should beat them at? How am I not chasing the person who's ahead of me and saying, how do I get to that level? And so that whole shift really was that journey. And honestly, I tell a lot of people, like, what sparked a lot of the compete every day was seeing people make the decision I made at 18. See them settle for jobs that sucked, play it super safe, go with the motion, settle for relationships that sucked because it was comfortable. And when I kept seeing them do it, I saw myself in them and was like, I know how heavy my regret, my shame, and embarrassment has been for over a decade. I don't want you to go through that. How can I help encourage you? And so that was really a big piece of it. So the shift was kind of going through the pits of understanding where I did it wrong and where that loss was, to really reframing the identity of consistently being a work in progress and just focused on how do I get better, and not, I don't need to be the best. I just want to be phenomenal at improvement, because over the long game, that's how you win.
Man, and that comparison, that is so difficult to get through. Especially in the days of social media, right? When we were growing up, the only thing you compare yourself to is like what you saw on the field, what you saw at school or whatever. Now it is just constantly inundating us. And I don't care if it's as a law firm owner, if it's as a husband, if it's as just a man. There are so many inputs coming in from all around us. You have to constantly and consistently be saying, all right, hey, yeah, I see that. That's really cool. That's awesome for him. I'm focused on me.
Yep.
I'm focused on me.
It's being intentional with what you allow that input to be. There's a really cool book called Thinking in Bets by Annie Duke. And she talks about how we have super outcome bias, and we tend to make decisions based off the outcome that we don't control, which is not always the best case. But she mentions in reference a research study in there. And they ask people, would you rather make, I want to say $20,000 a year living in 1900, where the average annual salary is $500, or would you rather live today making $100,000 a year? 3/4 of the people are like, put me in a time machine. I want to go back to 1900. I don't care that there's no penicillin, no internet, there's world wars coming, there's a Great Depression, like all of that. You're not going anywhere quickly. but I'll have more money than anybody else I know. Whereas today you're like, 100,000, but I won't have more money than most everybody I know. And that mind boggles me because of the idea of it's like, it doesn't matter if you're doing your best. If your neighbor has a nicer car, you feel like you failed. Ugh. And when you put that into that context, you think, well, my next door neighbor is a heart surgeon.
Right.
I'm not. Like,
he was in school for 30 years.
Yeah, there's a whole, how much debt does he have, right? I did a keynote in September for a bunch of small business owners. And we were talking about the importance of not chasing shiny objects and working the boring. And I said, social media, to your point, distracts us. I said, here's how I prove it. And I pulled up my social media from that point in 2018. And I said, what do you see here? You see me out traveling, seeing events, smiling, talking to people, all these cool pictures. Looks amazing, right? Here's the letter I wrote myself that day. And like, it shook a lot of them because I was like, I know people online who look like the world is great and it's not. We know from research that the more a couple promotes themselves on social media, the more likely they're dysfunctional and in counseling. We know where we try to seek validation from outside that it's worse within. And so when you understand that, when you understand the games that are played on an Instagram or a LinkedIn to where 40 people are in a group and they all comment on each other's post and it looks like, oh my God, there's 80 comments here and 100 likes. And you're like, I have 2 likes and one's my mom. Like, you feel like a letdown, but then you realize, oh, they're gaming the system. Like, it's not real. And once you start to understand that, you can better attune, like, oh, my thoughts are going comparison. What's in my control? What am I doing to take care of me? Great for them. What am I doing to take care of me? And to your point, it also puts us in a state to where we can cheer for each other. Yeah. Like you were just sharing offline about how you're like, Marcus is like one of the busiest and most productive people we know. And you could look at guys like him who every time we talk, I'm like, he's crushing it. And you can be envious. Or you can look at guys like that and you're like, man, he's in a completely different race, completely different lane. And I love seeing him win. And there's no threat to you. And how much more freeing it is to be able to celebrate this weekend when you crush the race and you hit your time and it's a whole new experience, whether you got first place in the race or you got your fastest time. What's going to give you the most fulfillment? Yeah. Your fastest time.
Absolutely. And so what are some things that you do to limit those outside distractions, right? There's social media, obviously. We all know that's not good for us.
Super intentional. Yeah. And what I tell people is you can be friends and follow people and not see their stuff. So there's in Instagram, it's the top 3 buttons in the top right corner. On Facebook, it's an unfollow. But you can hide things from your feed. So being very intentional with what's in your feed. I think that's the first one. I think setting timers of when you actually get on social media is an intentional one. One of the things I love to do is being very intentional with your self-talk and getting really good about asking yourself questions. When you feel that angst or that anxiety staring at somebody else and like, oh, I wish I had that. What do you enjoy about that situation? What are you doing to change yours? You know, we look at guys like a Michael Jordan or Kobe Bryant. We're like, man, I'd love to be that. I'd love to be the best of the best, but we probably wouldn't trade some of those personal relationships.
Yeah, and go read Tim Grover's book to see what those guys go through.
Yeah, good to go through that. Like, right? We can't have one piece of something and not everything else. That you want the reward, but you don't want the dysfunctional relationships or families or pain, all of that, right? Yeah. And so being aware of that is a big one. And I think a lot of it comes down to that self-talk. The other piece comes into what is your identity and how are you talking to yourself? Where do you find your identity? That's why I mentioned earlier about being this idea of a work in progress. I continually remind myself that because I want to know that every day I show up is a day closer to my best, which means every talk I give, no matter how great it is, I don't want my ego to get inflated with the idea of, oh, you're really good. I want it to be, oh, that was good. How do we make it better? And because that puts me in a field where I'm less threatened by people because I can say, what can I learn and where can I improve? And then the last is just continual intentionality of focusing on what's in your control. Even writing it down every week. One of the exercises we do is start, stop, continue. So every Friday afternoon, evaluate the week you just had. What do you need to start doing you haven't done? What do you need to stop doing that you're doing that's not productive? And what are you doing well to continue? And what that does every week is sets 3 targets that are within your control that ensure you grow. And as long as you keep hitting those targets, you're guaranteed to grow week after week after week throughout the year with things in your control. And so just being aware of your thoughts is a big one. You don't control them. We know however many thoughts you have a day, the numbers vary, but say you have 6,000 thoughts a day, 4,000 are most likely negative. you don't control the thoughts you have, you control the thoughts you listen to. So it's like songs on a radio. You hear a song come on the radio. Some of them you love, you crank it up, you roll down the windows, you sing along. Some you just hear, you don't really pay attention to. And some you change the channel because you're like, I don't like that. We've got to be intentional that when we hear the thought, we either redirect it or reinforce it. Instead of what most people do is we hear the thought and we let it run and we let it run, we let it run versus, okay, so why am I thinking this? And what am I actually envious about? What have they done to achieve that? What am I doing to achieve the same thing? What can I do right now to improve my situation? And then it shifts the focus back into you internally.
Interesting. How do you practice that? Is that something that you meditate on? Are you a meditator?
I mean, I'm actually not a huge meditator. My ADHD is a little nuts for that.
Oh yeah, that'd be very difficult for you, I would imagine.
Very difficult. What I do say is I just try to be aware of when my emotional state shifts. So we can all feel when you get a little anxious.
Yeah.
So like, it was really funny. This morning is a perfect example. I woke up, my team had sent me a DM. Snoop Dogg posted one of our graphics on Instagram.
Pretty big deal.
Pretty big deal. Except he didn't tag us. He reposted from someone else who also didn't tag us. They just pulled our graphic and posted it. I immediately feel myself getting anxious and angry of like, that could have been, like, we could have gotten this.
Snoop, you know better than that.
I know. And so then I start to pull the thread of why am I bothered? Well, because I wanted the attention from the graphic. Okay, so why do I want the attention? Because that's a really big name. Okay, so why aren't you upset? Or can I look at it and say, it's really cool that someone in that position found value from something we created. Okay, how do we do more of it? What's in our control? But it's kind of like working out, right? Or it's kind of like running. Like the first day you go run, you don't run a marathon. You maybe don't even run a mile. You do a lap around the neighborhood. How do you start to build it up? And it all starts with building it up. And the best way I say is like the negativity runs wild unless you have a reason to change it. And the reason to change it, we call it our mental carry-on. Really, this is helpful in times of lacking of confidence. But I've heard sports psychologists call it a file cabinet, a locker. I call it a carry-on as a guy who travels all the time, right? I've got to have the perfect backpack for the airplane, pull out my laptop, have a snack, phone charger, whatever. I need to know where it is, grab it out and go. Our mindset and thought process is the same way. A lot of times when our negative thoughts run wild, it's because one, we're letting them run wild, but two, we're focusing on our lack and the gap between where we are and where we quote should be or someone else is. And when we do that, we tend to dismiss all the things we've done. You started
the gap in the game.
The gap in the game. You friggin' started a law. Like that's hard work. It's not like there's no competition, right? It's not like it's an easy process. But if you achieve something now, or if you're facing a challenge now, you could be so overwhelmed of like, man, I don't know if I can ever get through this. I don't do this. Instead of looking back and being like, I started a practice 2008. Here's where we are now. Like, look what we've done. So what we tell with the mental carry-on is to take out your phone, open a note, create a document, and write down all of your wins. Like any challenge you've ever overcome, anything you've done that you're proud of. And what I tell people to do is just to write and not edit, because we tend to dismiss the things we've done as normal, because what's normal to us, a lot of other people have started a law practice. A lot of other people have done this. Doesn't matter what other people have done. What have you done? Because at the end of the day, the hardest thing you faced and overcome is the hardest thing you faced and overcome. And so when you can create a list and you can keep it in your phone, it's like your wins. On the days you feel the comparison for where you're lacking, on the days you're lacking confidence to deal with the situation or a challenge, if you can go into that and say, well, on that day I showed up, I went to the gym, it was raining, it was cold, I was dealing with an injury, I still showed up and got a workout. It wasn't the best, but I did the work on the day I didn't feel it. I can show up and do the work today to prepare for that trial. Like it gives you the confidence to say, I've done this before. Let me do it again. And so that's how you start to redirect those thoughts, is you become aware of them. And then when you feel them go that way, you say, what's in my carry-on that can help redirect this? And so that's a big one. So it's making lists. It's writing down what thoughts you're hearing, which most people are like, I don't want to sit down and write my thoughts. But here's the deal. Until you're aware of a behavior, you can't change it.
Yeah.
And I tell people all the time, like, the big changes we want to see are the results of Lego block size adjustments, little bitty choice. And so the choice to sit down one day and spend 3 minutes writing down, why am I feeling a certain way about this person? Where am I stuck? What do I envy of theirs? What am I doing to improve it? 2 to 5 minutes. But what it does is it builds the awareness and helps you redirect your focus, when most people will be like, yeah, that's silly, I'm not going to do it, and still struggle with it.
Yeah. I love that, man. I love the list. I talk about it as mental assets, right? Like, hey, I know I can get through this half marathon that I have coming up on Sunday because I've done it before. I've done it a couple of times before. And so, mile 10, 11, 12, definitely, as we head towards mile 13, legs are hurting. But hey, I've done it before. I know I can do it again.
You know what I love about that? So this is, I did an event with High Rocks last month, and we talked about that, right? The mental carry-on, the mental assets. The other thing I told them in the moment is when you're in the middle of it, force yourself to smile when it hurts.
Yeah.
And I said, what I always told myself literally while I was running the High Rocks race back in November that I did not train for, my calves went out. Like I am speed walking around the course.
Yep.
And every time I lap people, I said, I'm doing the thing they wish they were out here doing. Why? Because I've been on the sideline at a triathlon. I've been on the sideline of a competition and been like, that looks like they're having fun. I wish I was out there. I said, and they're watching it. And so every time you do the thing that other people didn't make the decision to do, take pride in it. And so when you tell yourself that, you operate out of gratitude. When you operate out of gratitude, you perform better. So even though it hurts, even though it sucks, it's going to suck going in. At mile 10, 11, 12, things are going to hurt.
Right.
So you expect it. It's like for me, every time I go for a run, the first mile is going to be the worst. I'm just telling myself now, if I can get through the first mile, I can keep going. You show up differently in those moments when you change how you talk in those moments. And so I love that. I love that you have those mental assets. And so now I'm just going to tell you, like, every time you see people on the sideline holding those funny signs, be like, yeah, they wish they were doing this. So I'm going to keep going.
There you go. I love it, man. All right. We are out of time, but one last question for you. Real quick, 3 best books.
Oh, man. Atomic Habits.
Love it.
By James Clear. Mindset by Carol Dweck is a phenomenal one. The third book I would recommend, I'm trying to think if I want to go for a curveball here or not.
Go for it.
Actually, I like this. The 4 Agreements by Don Miguel Ruiz.
Classic
book. I would have to actually I'm gonna replace Don Miguel. I love you, Don Miguel. I love 4 Agreements. Soundtracks by John Acuff, just based on our conversation. It is a non-sciencey, science-backed book on affirmations and how you talk to yourself. And it's packaged as how to deal with over anxious thoughts, but really it's affirmations and self-talk in a way that most people will accept, and it's not woo-woo. It's actually incredibly practical.
Awesome. Jake, thank you so much for being here today. And thanks to all of you who have tuned in to another episode of the Driven Crowd Podcast. We'll see you next time.